Good day. Today is Saturday, 13th September 2025, and I'm going to start this program by returning to the topic that I was discussing at the start of my program yesterday, which is the scandal in Britain involving Britain's former ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson, who the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, had been forced to sack after further information about Mandelson's connections with Jeffrey Epstein became public news. Well, over the last few hours, since I made my video, that scandal has got worse in a way that I think does perhaps maximum damage to Keir Starmer's position. When Mandelson was sacked yesterday, the explanation that the British government gave was that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the new Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, had concluded that Mandelson's position was untenable because emails had appeared which appeared to confirm that the relationship, the friendship between Mandelson and Epstein was closer than had been previously suspected. Well, the information that is all over the media in London today is that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, publicly defended Mandelson and insisted that he would remain ambassador after the emails between Epstein and Mandelson had come to light, and that notwithstanding the existence of those emails, the Prime Minister had publicly defended Mandelson and had insisted that Mandelson would stay in place. Now, one can come up with explanations. One could say that the emails had come to light, but that they hadn't yet been read properly, or that Starmer himself had not yet read the emails, or that he'd been misled about the contents of the emails. But to say it frankly, it really doesn't look very good. One would have thought, and perhaps it's worth remembering, that Keir Starmer is a lawyer, a senior barrister, a King's Counsel, the man who for many years was Britain's chief prosecutor as director of the Crown Prosecution Service. Anyway, one might have expected that a person in Keir Starmer's position, knowing that a new cache of documents concerning Peter Mandelson had come to light, would take the trouble to familiarise himself with those documents properly before making public statements and taking public positions defending him. Indeed, I'm going to say that I would have expected not only Starmer to have done that, but that as a lawyer, this would have been something that he would have automatically chosen to do. It's a little like a lawyer discovering just before he was going into court that new evidence had come to light, and going into court without taking the trouble to acquaint himself with that evidence. It seems to me a very strange and surprising thing to do. And given the importance and the gravity of this issue, again, I would have expected Keir Starmer, together with Yvette Cooper, before making statements defending Peter Mandelson, to have personally examined these emails, these particular documents, in order to find out what was there. So this is going to be a difficult a difficult thing to explain away. And of course, to say what is obvious and what many people in London are saying, the fact that these documents were already out there, that Downing Street, the British government, already knew of their existence, does certainly cast doubt on Keir Starmer's judgment, if that is the way you want to put it. I would say that it actually asks many, many more questions about the affair, the entire affair, and what the exact connection between Mandelson and Keir Starmer and Keir Starmer's extraordinarily powerful Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, what their connections to each other actually was. Now, I'm going to express my own opinion about that, by the way, which is that I think a lot of people have got this relationship between Mandelson and Starmer actually wrong. In my programme yesterday, I spoke about how Mandelson has a very, very long record in British politics, how he was already prominent in British politics by the end of the 1980s, how he ran Labour's election campaign during the general election of 1987, and the enormous influence within the Labour Party that Mandelson has at various times operated, and not just influence in the Labour Party, he has also had significant influence within the political system as a whole, and as happened at the time of the Brexit referendum, he was, of course, at that time advising the Conservative British Prime Minister, David Cameron. So we're talking about a very well-connected, very influential person, somebody who has been in British politics for a very long time. In fact, thinking about it, the only individual in British politics of similar prominence who has been involved in politics for as long as Mandelson has been, that I can think of, is Mandelson's great enemy, formerly within the Labour Party, now currently in the business of forming a new left-wing party to rival the Labour Party, in other words, Jeremy Corbyn. So that gives a sense of how long Mandelson has been around. And it was obvious to me, at least, that Tony Blair gained prominence and position in the Labour Party initially because Mandelson supported him. In other words, it was Mandelson who was more instrumental in raising up Tony Blair than Tony Blair who was instrumental in raising up Mandelson. And I suspect something very similar happened with respect to Keir Starmer. I can remember during the campaign, during the Brexit war, to arrange to have a second referendum, in other words, to cancel the original Brexit referendum, and to have another referendum with a predetermined outcome in its place. I can remember how at that time Mandelson and Starmer were clearly working together, and of course Starmer was a member of the cabinet and he was in the House of Commons, and Mandelson was not, but it was obvious to me even then that it was Mandelson and of course Tony Blair who were running things behind the scenes. In fact, I know that several people who attended one of the big second referendum protests in London at that time were astonished at the prominence that key Blairite figures from the time of Blair's government, including first and foremost Peter Mandelson, seem to be front and centre in addressing the people who were participating in the protest. So Starmer owes Mandelson his position as leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, if not entirely, then undoubtedly to a great degree. And Morgan McSweeney, who has been Keir Starmer's all-powerful chief of staff, in fact, many people believe that Morgan McSweeney is the real Prime Minister of Britain, more so than Keir Starmer himself is. Morgan McSweeney is known to have a very strong connection to Mandelson, and it was Morgan McSweeney who apparently originally insisted that Mandelson be appointed ambassador to Washington. Mandelson was not just appointed ambassador to Washington as a reward for his previous support for Starmer. I think he was put in a strong position, in a powerful position, an executive position, in effect, as part of the government, because he continued to wield great influence in the British government and over Keir Starmer. So if you understand things in that sort of way, then it perhaps begins to become more understandable why, even after a cache of documents appears, Starmer and McSweeney might be, shall we say, nervous or slow to act on those documents in order to remove from the scene an individual, Peter Mandelson, of immense influence, and someone to whom ultimately both men might owe their job. Now, I don't think this scandal, this latest twist in the scandal, is going to be enough yet to bring Keir Starmer down. There is increasing calls, there are mounting calls within the Labour Party, including within the Labour Parliamentary Party, to sack Morgan McSweeney, who is Starmer's chief of staff. I'm not sure that they will succeed, but I don't think that they yet rise to the level of calling into question Keir Starmer's premiership. I think there is an understanding within the Parliamentary Party that at the moment, given that the party doesn't even have a deputy leader, because Angela Rayner had to step down last week, it's simply impossible to remove Keir Starmer because there is no convincing person who can simply and easily take over. And it's been suggested that another Blairite cabinet minister, Wes Streeting, might eventually be that person, but he hasn't been presented to the country or to the party as that person yet, and there is still work to do. But if, as is possible, Starmer is forced to dismiss Morgan McSweeney, then the brains behind his government, the brains behind his premiership, the man who is universally believed to be the backstreet driver, if I can put it like that, in terms of this entire Labour government, the man who has picked the MPs, picked the cabinet ministers, whose influence over the last year appears to have grown and grown, that person will have been removed from the scene, and Starmer himself will have been fatally weakened. So we are at an interesting potential turning point in this scandal. It is not impossible that it might cause McSweeney to fall. And it seems to me that if that happens, then the fall of Starmer himself becomes only a matter of time, and it may very well be not that much time. Anyway, this is what I'm going to say about this affair today. Intrigues and conspiracies of this kind are not unusual in British politics. I've discussed and commented upon them in the past, and we've done programs on the Duran about them. This is an unusual scandal, however, in some ways, and I think I am right in saying that if it does eventually result in Starmer's fall, it will be the first time that a Labour Prime Minister who has won an election by a landslide, and become Prime Minister in that way, will have been ousted from his position by his own party, the Labour Party. If we're talking about the Conservative Party, that happens often. It happens all the time. We have on the Conservative backbenches four Conservative leaders: Theresa May, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and Liz Truss. And in each and every case that happened to them, they were ousted from their position by their parties. And if we go further back in time, the same, of course, happened to Margaret Thatcher when she was pushed out of power by her own party, the Conservative Party, in what was an internal party coup, which took place in 1990. This would be the first time that such a thing has happened in the Labour Party, but it is not the same Labour Party that it once was, as I have pointed out many times, and, well, there's always a first time. Anyway, it's perhaps worth keeping an eye on this, and of course, if there's a deeper political crisis in France, all of this could quite easily work through into a deeper political crisis in Britain as well. Anyway, let's move on and discuss other things, and let's first of all turn to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and the West. And of course, we've had more confusing, contradictory, inconsistent statements by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. So in my program yesterday, I discussed how a strong delegation had been sent from the United States to meet with the President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, how there'd been all kinds of polite exchanges and exchanges of letters between the Americans and Lukashenko, how Lukashenko gave the Americans public advice on how to discuss questions of Ukraine settlement with the Russians, and how the Americans announced steps to relax sanctions on Belarus and agreed to restore air links to Belarus. And I explained that restoring air links to Belarus, given that the European Union has closed its airspace to the Belarusian national airline, ultimately means that if the Belarusian national airline is going to be involved in transporting passengers to the United States, then it can only realistically do so by crossing Russian territory, and that would be a major step towards re-establishing air links between the United States and Russia. Of course, and in theory, direct flights from the United States to Belarus involving American airlines could take place. But why would they exactly? Why would American commercial airlines be interested in transporting passengers to a place like Belarus? It seems to me that that would be an obvious loss-making proposition. And even as a geopolitical play, given the extent of Belarus's ties with Russia, it really doesn't seem to me to make a great deal of sense. Well, that was yesterday. Today, we're getting more reports from Bloomberg that point in the diametrically opposite direction. There's a G7 meeting looming. The Americans are apparently going to insist at this meeting, or at least demand at this meeting, that the Europeans do go ahead and impose their massive draconian 100% tariffs on China and India, as well as Russia, and that the Europeans take further steps to seize the various confiscated, or rather not confiscated, frozen assets of the Russian central bank and of other Russian state bodies, but also private businessmen that have been frozen on the territory of the European Union since the start of the special military operation. So the Americans are going to bring all of that up again, and they're going to demand these things. And we've heard reports from Europe over the last week that the Europeans are not prepared to impose 100% tariffs on India and China, that they've rejected that idea. Bloomberg tells us that they've also pointed out to the Americans that getting the Hungarians and the Slovaks to agree to this is going to prove extraordinarily difficult, especially given the effect of that on the Hungarian and Slovak economies. The Europeans have apparently also told the Americans that they cannot for the moment do without Russian oil supplied to them via the Turk Stream pipeline, and also, by the way, laundered through India, that they can't do without that oil. The United States has told the Europeans that it is currently looking at ways to replace Russian oil and liquefied natural gas, which the Europeans are not so far importing from the United States. The Europeans would be extremely unwise, to put it mildly, to rely on those assurances. But anyway, those are the reports. The Americans supposedly are suggesting that. And there are also reports that the Europeans, well, not reports, there have been many reports, public statements from people like Friedrich Merz and the Belgian Prime Minister and other European officials, and particularly strong statements from the chief executive of Euroclear, that outright confiscation of Russian assets, frozen Russian assets, is unacceptable. It is a legal red line that simply cannot be crossed. So what is going on? Why are the Americans, who appear to be acting in a slightly more accommodating position towards the Russians, in one respect, why are they making further demands of the Europeans to drastically upgrade their sanctions ahead of the G7 summit meeting in the way that they are apparently doing? Well, I floated in previous videos the possibility, in fact, overall my belief, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, doesn't really want to impose these draconian sanctions. He doesn't want to impose sanctions on India and sanctions on China, or tariffs, 100% tariffs on India and China. He doesn't want to do those things, and he's telling the Europeans that he's not going to do those things unless and until the Europeans agree to do them as well, and that this is all very useful and convenient for him, because as the Europeans are saying no to their doing these things, the President himself doesn't need to do them, and he can come along and tell people like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and others in the United States. Well, there's no point in the United States doing them when the Europeans are refusing to. So that has been my operative hypothesis. And I suspect my best guess is that this is still the case. There's also been, it must be said, however, contrary indications. The president gave another one of his interviews in which he spoke again about his frustration and disappointment with President Putin, about how Russia risks enormous sanctions if it doesn't come to heel. And, well, it could be, and the fact that the Americans are not taking no from the Europeans as an answer reinforces the view that this is indeed serious, that Trump has concluded that the only way that he can enforce some kind of peace agreement to end this conflict, which he has repeatedly said is his priority, is by mounting the enormous tariffs and sanctions that he can. Larry Johnson, the CIA analyst and commentator, and by the way, friend of mine, has written a good piece, a very good piece, on Sonar 21, in which he mentions the fact that various officials of the Trump administration are still showing an extraordinary lack of understanding of the realities of the Russian economy and still appear to believe that the United States has it within its power to bring Russia to heel or to collapse the Russian economy if it doesn't come to heel, and that this seems to be what the president has been told, and it may be what is again guiding his decisions. And what might reinforce that theory is the General Kellogg, whose appearances always seem to me to signal a hardline turn in the president's policies. General Kellogg has again resurfaced, and he's off to Kyiv. He's meeting Zelensky and other top Ukrainian officials there. He's always been an advocate of massive sanctions and tariffs and other things against Russia and its trading partners. And of course, he has never deviated from his original plan, the one that he outlined in his article written in April 2024, which is basically to seek a frozen conflict. And unfortunately, the story of this president, ever since his inauguration, is that he sometimes drifts to the side of Kellogg, sometimes he drifts to the much more realist side of his other peace envoy, Steve Witkoff. Witkoff currently is tied up trying to put out fires in the Middle East. So he's perhaps not giving the president the advice that perhaps he should be receiving. And it may be that at this moment in time it is Kellogg and people who think like him in the administration who are gaining influence. Well, I don't know where this is going. There's again more reports, more claims that there'll be further sanctions on Russian banks. I really cannot understand what that means exactly. There is talk that the United States and the Europeans, as part of their 19th sanctions package, might sanction Russia's interbank payment system. Just saying. Why the Americans think that will work, why they think that is going to change things, I really don't understand. The vast majority of transactions using the Russian interbank payment system are being conducted within Russia. the Russians are starting to connect this interbank payment system to other countries, Iran, for example, but then Iran itself is also heavily sanctioned. Up to fairly recently, the Chinese have been reluctant to engage with sanctioned Russian entities. But in the last few weeks, they've changed their stance on this. They've moved forward with the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. They've reactivated the joint projects for aircraft building, for wide-body jets and helicopters with the Russians that were put on ice back in 2019, but then seem to have been permanently dropped during the pandemic and the sanctions. But the Chinese now seem to have reverted and reactivated all those plans, which seem to be moving forward rapidly. There's a lot to say on this topic. The Russians have made significant developments in aircraft engine building. I will probably want to discuss this at more length at some other time. The Chinese have recently confirmed that Russian corporates are now going to be allowed to float bonds, so-called panda bonds, in the Chinese financial markets, enabling them to acquire, in effect, RMB funding in Chinese currency, in Chinese RMBs, whereas, of course, before 2014, the Russians used to float their bond issues in European markets. They're now going to be floating them in what are actually bigger and deeper Chinese markets, just saying. And, well, recently, just over the last week or so, the Chinese have started to import liquefied natural gas from Russia, buying that gas from a major LNG facility that had particularly provoked the wrath of the Biden administration, and which the Biden administration had sought to close down by massively sanctioning. So the Chinese have undercut those sanctions by buying directly LNG from it. So given that this is the direction that China is currently taking, given that India is continuing to buy oil from Russia and shows no sign of changing its stance on this, given that India has also invited President Putin to visit India in December of this year, and given, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that there has been an emergency BRICS summit meeting, as I always expected that there would be, to develop counters to American tariffs and sanctions pressure, a meeting convened by President Lula of Brazil. Given all of this, put aside questions about whether the oil and gas tariffs, the penalties on India and China with respect to them buying Russian oil and gas, put aside whether that will succeed. It clearly won't. What is all this talk about further sanctioning Russian banks? It makes absolutely no sense to me. Turkey appears already to have found a workaround to this, because, as I discussed in a recent program, despite sanctions or threats of sanctions against Turkish banks and financial institutions from the European Union and the United States, which operate Russian Mir cards and process Russian payments. Given that Turkey is doing all of this, well, does the United States intend to threaten Turkey? Is that really what the United States wants to do? To sanction and threaten its own NATO allies? It seems to me extraordinary that Turkey would want to, that the United States would want to do that. And of course, the Turkish President Erdogan, was also in China a week ago, meeting with President Xi, meeting, by the way, with President Putin, giving every sign of wanting to be a member of that club. Is it the intention of the Americans, of the US government, to make that club even bigger and even stronger? This is all very difficult to understand. Larry Johnson almost certainly is right that people in the administration continue to underestimate the economic resiliency of the Russian economy and continue to underestimate the strength and resilience of the BRICS SCO combine that is now emerging. But how much evidence by now do they actually need? Well, we will see whether this is just another attempt to call the Europeans bluff in order to do nothing, or whether this is for real. We will also have to see what the Europeans themselves intend to do. But to repeat again, I don't think that the Russians are scared of this. Now, in the Bloomberg article, or at least in an early edition of the Bloomberg article, I read a comment that the Trump administration people believe or have persuaded themselves that the reason Putin agreed to that summit meeting in Anchorage back in August was because he wanted to avoid the sanctions and tariffs, the bone-crushing sanctions and tariffs that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and the hardliners in the Senate were demanding and which Donald Trump was threatening. That is not so. And the sooner this is understood and acknowledged, the better. When the summit meeting took place, it became absolutely clear right from the first moment, and we have all of the evidence now that confirms this, that Putin was making no substantive concessions on any of the issues in contention at all. He still insists that Ukraine cannot join NATO. He still insists that European forces cannot be present in Ukraine. He still demands demilitarization and denuclearization of Ukraine. He still wants the territories, the four regions, to become part of Russia. There's been some discussion about whether he offered a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region if the Ukrainians withdrew from Donbass. I don't think he offered that. I think perhaps Witkoff and the Americans floated the idea and Putin didn't reject it outright. But so far, there has been no public change of position by the Russians on the issue of the four regions. Publicly, they continue to insist that the entire territory of the four regions is Russian and must be transferred back to Russia. And this, since the meeting in Anchorage, has been said by Putin, by Lavrov, and by Putin himself. And, well, there's all the other things, the restoration of the Russian Orthodox Church, against which, by the way, over the course of the last week, the Zelensky government has taken further action, and the re-establishment of all the rights, linguistic and educational and other rights, cultural rights, and no doubt political autonomy, of Russian speakers in Ukraine. There's been all of that. There is no sign that the Russians have made any compromises or retreated on any of these points at all. What I think brought Putin to Anchorage, what lured him there, if you prefer, is not American threats, bone-crushing sanctions, or any of that sort of thing. Rather, it was American agreement that the demand for an interim ceasefire, a ceasefire prior to the start of negotiations, that proposal, with which the Russians were never happy and which they always basically opposed, that proposal would be dropped. And that was why Putin went to Anchorage, why he met Trump there. He clearly wanted again to explain in person to Trump the history of the war. He never agreed, as we now know, to a one-to-one meeting with Zelensky or a three-part meeting with Zelensky and himself and Trump. He never agreed to any of those things. He's not agreed or made any commitments about anything else at all. He's not retreated on security guarantees. He's not acted in any way, as one would expect, someone who was acting under pressure to do. And there is no reason to think that he felt pushed or pressured into holding that meeting with Trump in Anchorage. So if that is what the Trump people now believe, what they're telling themselves, they could not be more completely wrong. Just saying. So anyway, I hope that the administration is not drifting back into a position of imposing massive sanctions and tariffs against Russia, India, and above all China over the next few weeks. Not only would that prolong the war, but it would create massive economic problems. Of this I am sure. In the West, the Chinese almost certainly will again withhold supplies of rare earths. There will be manufactured goods shortages in Europe and in the United States itself. Inflation will rise. That will put more pressure on the Fed, not to lower interest rates, as it appears to want to do, and as it perhaps ought to do, given that we now have evidence that the United States is in recession. But rather, it will increase pressure, with inflation, it could force them to increase interest rates at a time when the United States is in recession, to deal with the inflationary impact of the trade war. And that's just the United States. I cannot imagine what harm such a thing will do to Europe itself. Anyway, we shall have to wait and see. With this president, the president who one day says that Putin is a brilliant leader, somebody he can do business with, who applauds Putin when they meet in Anchorage, who claps him and arranges for Putin to have air displays and air flyby passes and all that. Anyway, he does that one day. He makes all these threats the next day. You can never be completely sure where all this is going. I would add that there is a theory about Trump that he does all this on purpose, that this is something that he learnt from Cohen, or Kuhn, as I believe he called himself, Joe McCarthy's former assistant, the man who supposedly befriended Trump back in the 70s and gave Trump advice on how to keep adversaries continuously off balance, and that this is all part of some great, cunning, clever strategy. All I would say about that is that if that is the strategy, it is obviously a bad one, and which has evidently failed, because the Russians have never let themselves be rattled by it, and it is inconceivable to anybody who knows the Russians that they would be. And all it has ultimately managed to do is to consolidate and strengthen the BRICS. So, if this is that, and by the way, I don't believe it is, I think it is the president unable to make up his mind and changing his view depending on who he is speaking to at any one particular point, and perhaps playing poker and bluff with Lindsey Graham and the Europeans as well. Anyway, I don't myself think it is anything like that. But if it is, then it is a wrong strategy, and it is prolonging the war. Now, the Russians, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that for the moment the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, the ones in Istanbul, are on pause. And they are. And the Russians have been quietly complaining, there have been articles about this in the Russian media, that since Anchorage there has been no forward movement in the negotiations at all. At the last meeting in Istanbul between the Ukrainians and themselves, the Russians proposed the setting up of 3 working groups to examine to work out possible routes towards a final settlement. The Ukrainians were never happy with that proposal, and they've never responded to it, and there is no sign of those 3 working groups being set up. The Russians, Putin himself, discussed with Trump in Anchorage and over their one subsequent telephone call the possibility of upgrading the Russian chief of the negotiating team in Istanbul if the Ukrainians moved forward to discuss the setting up of these working groups, but with the Ukrainians showing no interest in that, that also has essentially come to a stop. The Russians are also saying that they've had no movement with the Americans themselves at all. There have been no further meetings between senior American officials and senior Russian officials as to how to take the matter forward, how to take the discussions, the bilateral ties between these 2 countries forward. There have been no further meetings between Witkoff and Dmitriev, the Russian representative. There have been no travels by Witkoff to Moscow. Trump occasionally floats the possibility of another telephone call between Putin and himself, but nothing like that ever seems quite to happen. So the entire negotiation process is indeed stuck. It is indeed on pause. And I personally believe it will remain so until and unless there is some major change on the battlefronts. And for the record, unless there is such a change, I don't believe there is going to be any change in the political line in Kyiv, and I don't believe the political line in Kyiv is going to change anyway, whilst Volodymyr Zelensky remains Ukraine's president, and I don't believe that there will be any change in Zelensky's position as president unless there is some major change on the battlefronts, and I'm not even sure that such a change would even happen in that event. So, as I said, for the moment, the whole negotiation process is stuck. Lots of people come up with interesting plans. Lots of people talk about all sorts of workarounds, the various obstacles of the differing Ukrainian-Russian positions. Some of these plans seem to me more interesting and viable than others. If a genuine good faith negotiation actually were underway, it could be that some of these plans might bear some fruit. But as of this moment in time, nothing like that is actually happening. Now, the only back channel continues to be the one that Lukashenko is offering. He gave advice to the Americans about how they might pursue diplomacy with the Russians further, but for the moment, nothing like that is being done. This remains one of the most extraordinary, mismanaged, chaotic negotiation processes I have ever seen. It's clear to me that the Anchorage meeting took place without proper preparation, which is why there might have been genuine misunderstandings on each side about what the other was prepared to do. Lavrov, and by the way, Putin, have suggested that the Americans have indicated that they might be willing to revisit the question of the security architecture of Europe. I've never believed that the Americans were prepared to do anything like that. The Americans might have thought that Putin was willing to consider NATO-style security guarantees to Ukraine, freezes of the conflict lines in Kherson and Zaporozhye region, trilateral meetings with Zelensky and Trump. But again, there's never been any indication that the Russians were interested in any one of these things. We had this constant stop-start situation in the negotiations. And in the meantime, of course, the Russians remain focused on the war, and the war goes on. Now, once again, and somewhat to my embarrassment, I'm going to have to return briefly, and I really do mean briefly today, to the topic of the drones that crossed over into Polish territory from Ukraine, and which undoubtedly were Russian drones. Now, there's been a number of things that people have been saying about these drones. Firstly, there's been pictures of a house in Poland which it was claimed had been damaged, the roof of which it was claimed had been damaged by one of these drones. That, as far as I know, is the only definite evidence of damage from the drones that has been alleged up to now. Well, I say definitely established, but there are now stories that are contradicting that claim also. There's been what appear to be interviews published, given by villagers, Polish villagers from the village where this house was located, saying that all of the damage done, including to this house, which has been shown in the pictures, all the damage of this village, was the result of a storm that took place some weeks before. It had nothing to do with the drones, and that any claim that it did is simply wrong. Now, I have to say, I was bewildered when I read that, because I've also read on the BBC an interview with an individual who claimed that he was the owner of the house in question, in which he clearly seemed to be giving the impression that the house had indeed been damaged by the drone. There may be ways to reconcile these seemingly conflicting stories, and I'm not going to explore them in this program. I will merely say that there is a question mark now, a genuine question mark, about the damage to the house and to the other structures, apparently, which has been attributed to the drones. Whereas it seemed that this damage was certainly attributable to the drones, it now seems that that may not quite have been the case. The other piece of information relates to the drones themselves, and a number of people have pointed out that the drones, always cheap-looking drones, do show signs of appearing to have been patched together. There are claims that one of the drones shows what looks like tape, covering some kind of crack, presumably, on the drone. Commentators have absolutely correctly pointed out that even allowing for the fact that these are cheap decoy drones, it is inconceivable that the Russians would have launched them against Ukraine in that kind of condition. And there are claims that the fact that these drones have these patches on them is a sign that this was indeed a fabricated event cobbled together by Ukrainian intelligence. I noticed that Stephen Bryan, who writes for Asia Times and who is a former senior Pentagon official and who I know to be an extremely shrewd man, leans to that view. Now, let me stress again, I'm not saying it is wrong, but of course there might be explanations as to these patches. It could be that the people who applied those patches to the drones were the Poles themselves, that they were applied to the drones after the drones fell in order to try to keep them intact in some way. Again, just to repeat, I am not saying that this is the truth or what actually happened. I don't know one way or the other. All I will say at this point in this program is this: those who want to believe, and there are a lot of people like that, who want to believe or who do believe that this was a false flag, now do have some more evidence that appears to support that conclusion. I am not prepared to go quite that far myself, but I do accept that there is a trend of the evidence that is starting to point that way. To repeat once more, the one way to establish the truth is for the Ukrainians to take up the Russian offer and to meet with the Russians and to conduct some kind of joint investigation. But of course, nothing like that is being considered or discussed. Anyway, let's move on and talk about more substantive things, because there's actually been quite a lot of very interesting information from the front lines. And the first thing to say is that there's been an awful lot of information over the last 24 hours from Kupiansk. And the Ukrainians, and the information interestingly is coming from the Ukrainians, they're saying that the reason the Russians were able to break into Kupiansk, were able to establish a presence deep inside Kupiansk itself, were able to capture positions in Kupiansk, was because the Russians used yet another pipe, water pipe, that connected central Kupiansk to various presumably industrial and water pumping facilities quite a considerable distance from Kupiansk, and that Russian soldiers moved along this pipe, moved a distance of 6 kilometers to be precise, along this pipe, and were able to appear suddenly in central Kupiansk and to capture positions there. And supposedly more Russians are entering Kupiansk via this pipe, and it is this which is the reason why Ukrainian resistance in Kupiansk is now in the process of breaking down. Well, of course, we've heard the story before. This is what happened in 2024, early 2024, in the case of Avdiivka. That is undisputed. It is what happened in the case of the fall of Sudzha back in March, and the Ukrainians are now telling us that it happened again in connection with what is now looking like the imminent collapse of Kupiansk itself. Now, here I will confess a pattern. Whenever I hear stories about pipes being used in this way by the Russians, my immediate response is one of deep skepticism. I've always doubted that these stories could possibly be true. They always had, for me, an extraordinary ring to them. And on the previous two occasions, Avdiivka and Sudzha, I've then been embarrassed when it turned out that the stories were true. So this time, despite the fact that all my instincts are to express the same skepticism, I'm not going to do so. More probably than not, this story actually is true. What ultimate difference does it make in terms of the overall direction of the war? It does show, once again, the incredible discipline and toughness of some Russian soldiers. I've seen pictures of the pipe. It is extremely small and narrow pipe. I can see that a man might be able to walk through, but to do so for 6 kilometers seems to me astonishing, even if we're talking about very strong, very tough, very fit young men. To do it for 6 kilometers and not to give way to claustrophobia and any of that, not to be affected by the isolation, and to do so in complete secrecy, that does seem to me astonishing. And if it was done and done successfully, it would again show the proficiency of the Russian special forces. But one way or the other, it does seem to me that the key thing is that Kupiansk is falling, and there doesn't seem to be any doubt about this, and this surely would have happened sooner or later, sooner rather than later, irrespective of whether a pipe like this was used in that way at all. The fact that the Ukrainians are now bringing up the topic of the pipe is, to my mind, confirmation that the Ukrainians do expect Kupiansk to fall and are now preparing their people for that fact. They are saying that yes, we are indeed about to lose Kupiansk, but we did it not because we were outfought by the Russians. We did it, we're going to lose Kupiansk because those sly and cunning Russians were able to get behind our lines by using this pipe. That is what it suggests to me. And note that this story, if it does nothing else, it corroborates claims made some days ago by Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which regularly and in detail covers developments in the war, that the Russians had captured northern and central Kupiansk, that the Ukrainians were retreating towards the southern outskirts of Kupiansk, that they're busy transferring their soldiers in the Kupiansk area from the east bank of the Oskol River, where the Russians already are, to the west bank, where, of course, most of the city of Kupiansk is, in order to prevent those soldiers, those Ukrainian soldiers on the east bank from getting trapped, and that the eventual intention is to withdraw from Kupiansk entirely and to retreat to new defense lines to try to hold the even more important transport hub, which is the important town of Izium, the gateway to the Donbass, as it used to be called, which the Russians briefly controlled in 2022, and which, if they really do want to surround the Ukrainians in Donbass, they will undoubtedly need to recapture. So anyway, that's how it looks to me. It looks now as if the end of the Battle of Kupiansk is at most days away. I would regard this admission by the Ukrainians, or this story that the Ukrainians have published about this pipe, as essentially an admission of that fact. Now, there's also been a lot of fighting on the Liman and Seversk areas. I discussed in my program yesterday how there is now footage, video footage, of what looks like Russian strikes on the northern areas, industrial buildings and those things, of the large town of Yampol, village of Yampol rather, which lies between Liman and Seversk. I believe that it is now acknowledged that the Russians are fighting within the metropolitan area of Seversk, in the area of in a industrial area to the north of Seversk. It doesn't look as if the Ukrainians have recaptured the village of Serebyanka or anything like that, but it's now accepted that the Russians are in complete control of the Serebyanka and probably the Kremenaya forest to the north of Seversk. My own personal view is that Seversk is lost. I get the sense that the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian political and military leadership, are losing interest in Seversk. They are apparently still refusing to allow the Ukrainian troops in Seversk to withdraw. But I still think that possibly they might do so, that they might decide over the next few days to pull out of Seversk as well as Kupiansk and to concentrate on more defendable positions. And in the Liman area, very interestingly, the Russians, instead of advancing directly to the town of Liman, which they are nonetheless approaching, they seem to be moving towards Liman from the north, from a village called Kolodizy, which they captured about a week ago. The Russians are also, interestingly, they've crossed the river Nitrius, which is located to the north of Liman, and they appear to be pushing westwards. And partly, clearly, this is an intention to cut off Ukrainian supply lines, including to Liman itself. But it also looks to me as if it's intended to create another position from which the Russians can attack Izium, this time from the south, even as they will no doubt seek to attack Izium from Kupiansk, which is to say from the north. I have no doubt, by the way, that the priority of the Russians in this area is ultimately to take Izium. I don't agree with those who think that the Russians are going to instead focus their forces northward from Kupiansk towards Kharkiv. I've seen nothing to suggest that. Anyway, that's the battle that's going on in northeastern Ukraine. It's all very interesting, very complicated. Before I get to what remains, in my opinion, the main area of the battle, Pakrovsk and Kostiantynivka, I should say that the Russian advance westwards in Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk region is not only continuing, it is accelerating. The Russians are now west of the important village of Veliko Mikhailovka. It looks to me as if they're preparing to do an outflanking operation for that important village. Every day that passes, they seem to acquire more villages and more territory. They captured another one this morning, or at least announced that they did. Ukrainian resistance in this area appears to be very weak. I get the sense that there just aren't enough Ukrainian troops to hold the Russians in this area. Just as, by the way, the Ukrainians are also becoming increasingly weak in the Seversk Liman area, but they're even weaker in this area of Zaporozhye region. And the pace of the Russian advance is now becoming remarkably, surprisingly fast. And to be frank, I think they were going to reach the road, the big road that links Gulyapolye and Palagi to the other town of Pakrovsk, further north, the supply road, in other words, for Gulyapolye. I believe the Russians are going to reach this road, this important supply road, within a relatively short space of time, no more than a few weeks. At least that seems to me to be the case, unless the Ukrainians were to redeploy significant forces to this area, presumably from Pakrovsk, which up to now they're showing no sign of doing. Anyway, that's the situation in Zaporozhye region. This is the area at the moment of the fastest Russian advance, and it is very fast. The Russians seem to be advancing here several kilometers a day. Now, that then brings me to the Battle of Pakrovsk, and here I'm going to express certain opinions of my own. I've been looking at the map changes, and it seems to me that they basically stopped in the area of the Ukrainian counterattacks in northeast of Pakrovsk, the area of the Russian breakthrough. The Russians have released drone footage of the Russians bombing Ukrainian positions in the village of Vladimirovka, in the northeastern part of this breakthrough area. The Ukrainians claimed about a week ago that they've recaptured this village. They've never provided evidence of this video footage. The fact that the Russians are bombing this village, bombing Ukrainian positions in this village, suggests to me that the Ukrainians are indeed there, but it is consistent also with fighting taking place in that village as well. Everywhere else, it seems to me that the Ukrainians have no definite progress to show. And Radovka said a couple of days ago that the Ukrainian offensive has basically come to a stop. And that is how it is starting to look to me. The Ukrainians have piled up many of their best brigades in precisely this area. As I discussed in my program yesterday, they've been caught. That's left them out in the open so that they can be bombed and shelled by the Russian air forces and by the Rubicon drone operators and by the Russian raiding parties. And no doubt all of that is happening. But I don't see, even from Ukrainian sources, mapping projects, any real evidence of any further Ukrainian progress in this area. Now, it has been suggested by some people, Military Summary Channel, for example, that the purpose of this Russian breakthrough area in northeast of Pakrovsk was to attract Ukraine's best brigades to this area to give the Russians the freedom to advance elsewhere in Zaporozhye region, in Kupiansk, in Liman, in Seversk, as we will see in a moment, in Kostiantynivka as well. There may be some truth to that, but my own view is that Pakrovsk absolutely remains for the Russians a major priority. And I believe that the reason that the Russians broke through in this area back in August in northeast of Pakrovsk is that these forces that established themselves in these villages, these Russian forces, were there to shield and cover the other Russian forces that are steadily working through Pakrovsk itself. The Ukrainians are not able to send supplies to Pakrovsk. They're not able to reinforce the garrison in Pakrovsk itself. As a result of this bitter fighting that is taking place northeast of Pakrovsk, their best brigades are becoming depleted, and the Russians, in the meantime, continue to advance within Pakrovsk. Remember that Radovka is claiming that the Russians now control almost the entire western half of Pakrovsk, something which, as far as I know, no other Russian or neutral or Ukrainian mapping project has shown. But Radovka has, for its part, shown consistent reliability in its reports of the Pakrovsk fighting. And I suspect that they are providing information about the situation in Pakrovsk, which is probably true. Now, what the Russians have released is more video footage of Russian forces advancing north from the now captured village of Udachny. There was the bombing of the Pakrovsk mine that I discussed in my program yesterday, and the Russians have shown further footage of what appears to be an armoured vehicle advancing through a wooded area, hunting down Ukrainian troops who are located there as it pushes northwards towards the E50 road and to the village of Grishiny, with the ultimate purpose of cutting off completely that important supply road to the garrison in Pakrovsk. So Radovka, again, was ahead of the curve in reporting these advances in this area north of Udachny, and we now have proof that that what they said was true. And that, it seems to me, and the fighting in Pakrovsk itself, is where the really big battle is happening. Now, Syrskyi himself, the Ukrainian commander, has turned up in this area. He has visited the Ukrainian military units, the headquarters in the town of Dobropilia, to the north of Pakrovsk. In my experience, Syrskyi tends to do this when the situation is beginning to become critical. And what I think is happening is he's trying to spur on the Ukrainian forces, trying to break through in this area to the northeast of Pakrovsk, because he realizes that unless they're able to do that quickly, then Pakrovsk itself will be lost, and with it probably he could lose his own position. Anyway, that is my take on the battle of Pakrovsk that is taking place. Meanwhile, the Russians have also provided video footage which appears to confirm that their forces are now storming a dacha settlement to the southwest of Kostiantynivka. This dacha settlement apparently lies within the Kostiantynivka metropolitan area. The town of Kostiantynivka, in other words, is also being heavily pressed by the Russians. But for the record, I still don't believe that the Russians are going to make a major effort to storm and capture Kostiantynivka until they have secured Pakrovsk. I have no doubt that they will. The fact that the Ukrainians are not making progress, or don't seem to be making progress, northeast of Pakrovsk, is for them an ominous sign. They're losing many of their best men and their few remaining machines in a battle they have to win, but which they appear to be, on the contrary, losing. And I suspect that this is going to create much more anguish in Kyiv and conceivably even lead to a crisis there. Now, a couple of days ago, the former Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, left Ukraine. He then gave an interview to Corriere della Sera, I've discussed it already in one of my programs, in which he appeared to suggest that he has fled Ukraine to escape persecution by President Zelensky. He then contradicted that and suggested that Corriere della Sera, no less, Italy's newspaper of record, had misunderstood what he has said. He then said that he was attending various conferences, but that he was intending to return to Kyiv. The Russians, rather more sardonically, are saying that what really happened is that Kuleba, like others in Kyiv, is starting to see the writing on the wall and is securing his bolt holes. And that may be correct. There are also reports that conspiracies and plots in Kyiv against Zelensky are again underway. Evidence for that is minimal at the moment, but I will no doubt talk about that in my next program. This is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.